The fitness industry wants you to believe you need to completely overhaul your training and nutrition based on where you are in your menstrual cycle. But what if this trendy approach is actually working against your goals? Today, I've invited on expert dietitian Jillian Greaves to reveal what the science really says about hormones and exercise. Learn why rigid cycle-based protocols often backfire, discover the actual signs your body needs adjustments, and get practical tips to optimize your training based on your cycle without unnecessary restrictions. Welcome to Wits and Weights, the show that helps you build a strong, healthy physique using evidence, engineering, and efficiency. I'm your host, Philip Hape, and today I'm discussing cycle syncing with Jillian Greaves. Now, Jillian is a functional medicine dietitian and women's health specialist. She's helped thousands of women address their hormonal health through personalized nutrition and lifestyle interventions. She earned her master's in public health from Tufts University and has extensive clinical experience at institutions like the USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging. Today, you're going to learn why many standard cycle-based protocols often don't work, what your symptoms actually reveal about your body's needs, and how to personalize your approach. That's what we're all about, personalizing your approach while respecting your unique physiology. Jillian, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
And this is an exciting topic because there's a lot of misinformation about it. And I know we're going to clear that up today and people are going to be super crystal clear on what to do. People as in women, but you know what, men listening to this or coaches, it's really good information to understand because hormones in general are kind of a muddy topic. So the question I have for you just to right out at the gate, does it work? Does cycle syncing your training and or nutrition to the menstrual cycle work, or is it marketing to sell programs?
It is both.
There we go.
In my opinion, as you know, like all things, there's always so much nuance, right? And the way that I define cycle syncing in a general sense is, ultimately making supportive adjustments to your nutrition, your lifestyle throughout your cycle to kind of support fluctuating hormones. As females, particularly, women of reproductive age, our physiology does change as hormones fluctuate throughout the cycle. And there are definitely shifts that we can make and things that we can be aware of to better support and adapt to these changes. On the other end of the spectrum, when we're talking about, isn't it real? Social media has kind of blown up in terms of talking about a lot of different things, but with cycle syncing in particular, I've seen so much talk about it in recent years. And I think this is where things get a little bit murky or muddy, where in the online health space, cycle syncing has essentially turned into like this rigid diet or this plan that, women are trying to follow to a T. And I think an even bigger problem I'm seeing is that women are getting so zoomed in on like micro strategies with food, with, adjusting their training, that we kind of miss the forest for the trees. And like I see people on social media recommending you switch up the type of lettuce or the type of, nuts that you're eating based on the, day of your cycle that you're on. And ultimately we really just miss the mark when it comes to actually supporting the things that can make a difference with our training and with how we're feeling. And, while the body does mobilize, nutrients differently across the phases of the menstrual cycle, we have no data supporting that these like ultra specific microfood interventions and eating this type of lettuce on day 19 and this type of lettuce on day 25, is going to balance your hormones. It's just, again, we miss the forest for the trees, and that's really not what cycle syncing is at the end of the day.
Cool. That's a great answer. And this obsession with these micro strategies, or the 1%, I call them as well, it's a general thing, right? Because I guess the logic that I would apply is men or women, when you are in any one particular state, like a given week of your life, can you, at that level of detail, optimize perfectly for these things, or is it highly personal and it's really going to take a lot of experimentation and understanding? I mean, we're kind of leading where we're going here, but so then try to now break it up into what Nikki Sims, who was just on the show from Barbell Logic, she calls her 4 personas of the month, right? Like she's like 4 different people for the month.
Yep.
And now trying to do it for 4 different people every month for yourself, it's even going to exacerbate the error, let's call it. So you mentioned supportive adjustments and that physiology does change. So let's dig into the science or the reality of basic hormone physiology. maybe in general, and then also throughout the menstrual cycle, because some
Yeah.
people are just confused in general about this stuff. But let's break it down. We can talk about the phases. You can talk about how things change
Yeah.
in reality. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's break down kind of the four phases of the menstrual cycle, and then we can kind of get into talking about actually what's shifting, what's happening, and what we can proactively do to support the body. So in terms of the four phases of the menstrual cycle, we have our menstruation phase, which is technically our bleeding phase. We're on our period, and this is a period of time where overall hormone levels are at their lowest, at their very lowest throughout the cycle. From there, we enter the follicular phase. And this is a period of time where estrogen levels are on the rise. So the body is essentially maturing follicles, and the secretion of estrogen is increasing throughout the follicular phase. We then enter the ovulatory phase. That's where estrogen kind of hits a peak. And this is part of what's going to stimulate ovulation or the release of an egg. Moving on from the ovulatory phase, we then enter the luteal phase. So, this is a period of time in the menstrual cycle where both estrogen and the hormone progesterone are kind of at their highest. So, the overall hormone load in the body is higher at this time. The luteal phase is typically about a 2 week stretch of time, and the luteal phase will either end in your period or pregnancy. Those are, the only two options. And then, we enter the menstruation phase or that bleeding phase again and kind of start that cycle over. When it comes to kind of specifically like what's shifting with our physiology, what's happening as these hormones are ebbing and flowing throughout the cycle. So, starting with the menstruation phase, or that phase of time where overall hormone levels are at their lowest, this is actually a period of time where our immunity is a little bit higher, inflammation is a bit lower, and recovery is actually generally pretty good. Endorphins are higher at this period of time, and studies have actually found that strength and force production is higher, VO2 max is increased. So, like how much and how well your body is using oxygen during exercise. So, women across the board actually do experience or can experience more strength gains in their menstrual phase, which might be a little like counterintuitive based on some of the information online. But ultimately, that lower hormone load leads to increased resilience in the body. So if someone is feeling really good, that can be a time to, challenge yourself from a workout performance perspective. That being said, a lot of women aren't feeling their best, during their period in that menstrual bleeding phase, in which case, we always want to respond to that, listen to that, and lean into more rest if that's what the body is asking for. With then entering the follicular phase, again, this is where estrogen is increasing. Estrogen is on the rise. And this is a period of time, I will say, generally, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about, kind of symptomatic periods and different things going on. But the follicular phase is generally a period of time where women feel pretty good. Energy is higher. And, we kind of experience or feel more vitality throughout the follicular phase. And research does suggest that, strength adaptation, muscle recovery is better. Inflammation continues to be lower during this time in our cycle. So the follicular phase is usually a good time to challenge yourself, to focus on, higher intensity exercise, strength gains, and things that are maybe pushing the body a little bit more when our resilience and our recovery is higher. Something interesting to note about this rise in estrogen is that this does have some systemic kind of impacts on the body. One notable one is that our cells are actually more sensitive to insulin in the follicular phase, meaning we are better at utilizing glucose energy from food. But interestingly, carb storage and access to carbohydrates in our muscle and our liver is a little bit more difficult.
Hmm,
What
interesting.
does all of that mean? Essentially, we may want to amp up our carbohydrate intake, particularly around training in the follicular phase. Our body's going to be really great at utilizing that, energy. However, it's not quite as efficient at, tapping into energy stored in our muscles or, in our liver. So overall, I think on a foundational level in the follicular phase, I really emphasize with women focusing on the foundations and a really, balanced diet, consistent eating overall, but then really considering possibly amping up our carbohydrate intake to make sure that we have a lot of, energy readily available, particularly if we are amping up our training at this time.
Okay, this is great. I know we didn't get to the other two phases yet in the great detail you just went to, but I'm glad we stopped there because this is exciting to understand that you can leverage, how you feel during these phases or how your body responds, knowing that that is maybe unique to you, but also a thing that's going to happen periodically. And that's kind of getting to the questions about how do we then look at our training on an individual basis, not on a general basis, right? Because you said some women feel terrible during the menstruation period. And I was actually thinking I was going to ask you a little side question about particular conditions, like endometriosis is a big one that affects a lot of women. I think it's like 25% now. It's a huge number, including some people I know personally. And that definitely affects all of this. Where does that come in, or do we keep that for like a separate discussion?
Yeah, I mean, we can chat about that now. And I think because there's so many directions you could go here. And I think I'm talking about, all right, in a general sense, when these fluctuations are happening, how are they impacting the body? How can we support those things on a foundational level? When I think about endometriosis, I think about there being issues with estrogen and how we're breaking down and metabolizing estrogen. I think about the immune component in terms of that pro-inflammatory state that's often, kind of goes hand in hand with endometriosis. The gut imbalances that play a role here. So we want to consider those factors, 100%. And for someone, say with endometriosis that's having, issues with estrogen in terms of maybe they're overproducing estrogen, maybe they're metabolizing their estrogen in a way that's creating certain estrogen metabolites that are more, inflammatory or more proliferative. They may not be experiencing these shifts exactly how I'm describing them. And maybe they don't feel great during that follicular phase as, estrogen is increasing. In that case, I always say, first and foremost, listen to your body. The worst thing that we can do is ignore how our body's communicating with us. So if the body's asking for more rest or asking you to peel back on, the intensity of movement, so important to respond to that. In a general sense for, someone with endometriosis and say those issues with estrogen and, maybe gut imbalances or the immune kind of pro-inflammatory elements, we may also want to, and this is where we can get a little bit more zoomed in. But first and foremost, always need to focus on those foundations, make sure blood sugar's balanced, we're eating enough, all those core foundations are dialed in. From there, maybe we do focus on some micro strategies with food and we're bringing in, foods that help support, healthy estrogen metabolism and clearance. For example, we know cruciferous vegetables that are rich in sulforaphane can help with how we're processing estrogens and also have really great anti-inflammatory benefits. So, maybe we're kind of focusing on incorporating more of those cruciferous vegetables throughout, the follicular phase leading up to that estrogen peak. Maybe we're really amping up and diversifying our fiber intake. Fiber plays a really important role in, one, supporting, gut health, the gut ecosystem, our intestinal lining, regulation of the immune system, but it's also something that helps with, binding and eliminating excess estrogens if we need support with that estrogen clearance. So there's things that we can do that get a little bit more zoomed in, and can really be beneficial depending on, kind of the case. And that's where I think it's like, let's focus on those foundations and then pay attention to what our body is communicating with us throughout the cycle.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a lot of things in there that would trigger people, and they're the exact type of things that I mentioned that trigger people. But like, what's wrong with fiber and micronutrients, right? Like eating a huge diverse variety of fruits and vegetables. But, there's the carnivore camp and some other camps that kind of have a little bit of misinformation on that. And so that leads me back to the follicular phase when you talked about muscle recovery, adaptation. You also said the insulin sensitivity goes up, but glucose uptake doesn't necessarily follow. But that only means that you can't tap as quickly into your naturally stored glycogen, which I recommend most people lifting weights don't train fasted anyway, and like have at least a huge carb-based meal at night, which generally disrupts sleep, or better yet, eat before you work out if you're working in the morning, with just some carbs. It can be a banana or, depending. What are your thoughts on that, on carbs in general, on some of the messaging around carbs, on some of this stuff about like, well, women over 40 need to eat low carb, and it's a whole thing. So let's clear that up.
I know.
That could be its own episode.
I know. Oh my gosh, could it be? Yeah. I will honestly say that low carb diets are like the bane of my existence in terms of
I'm glad you said that.
my work in the women's health space. And I would say most all clients we work with, we are working to bring more carbohydrates, more quality carbohydrates into their diet. And I think what people often don't understand is that our low carb diets, particularly like these ultra low carb diets that we see women on, where there's not even a target there. It's like, let's just eat as little, carbohydrates as possible. This is a stressor on the body. It's incredibly stressful. And if we are experiencing, blood sugar crashes, blood sugar, dips in relation to, not eating enough carbohydrates, if we're not eating enough carbohydrates to actually support, recovery and muscle protein synthesis and all of these things, it's really working against us at the end of the day. And something I always say, which is like, I understand, I know is like a very oversimplified, message, but I think it hits home with people, is that carbs calm cortisol. So if we are not eating enough carbohydrates, we can actually experience dysregulation with cortisol, one of our, primary stress hormones, which is it's one of its biggest jobs is to keep blood sugar, regulated, and to make sure that we have, adequate energy for the body to use to, sustain day-to-day activities and functioning. So for a lot of women that we work with, I think that hits home in terms of, eating enough food in general, but particularly making sure we're getting enough carbohydrates can really help to support the body's stress resilience, to help, with balancing the nervous system, supporting metabolic health. And we can actually like reap the benefits of our workouts versus having it be, having workouts be in the context of, poor stress resilience, blood sugar wonkiness, and we're kind of, again, throwing gasoline on the fire or working against ourselves at the end of the day.
Yeah, you said so many critical things there, as well as some of the unsung benefits of carbs that I think are really important. I just want to re-emphasize 3 that you mentioned so people really get that message. By saying it's a stressor on the body, I love that, because now you could get the thought that you're dieting while not dieting. That's kind of the phrase I've used, right? Like you're low carb, even if your calories are quote unquote sufficient, you're still lacking significant resources for certain things that you care about when you're trying to lift weights, improve your body composition, even just move in general. And then you probably stack on top of that chronic forms of cardio that further exacerbate the issue. So that is huge. You mentioned muscle protein synthesis. You just kind of snuck it in there, and people are like, what does she mean? Isn't that what protein's for, right? But it's a, what do we call, anti-catabolic. I assume you're talking about the anti-catabolic effects of carbs. Are there any other aspects related to muscle synthesis you want to highlight there?
I think ultimately, I think the big ones being, carbs and protein together. Protein gets a lot of attention, but really the combination of these two is the secret sauce. Yeah. And then, I think timing is key too. When we're thinking about, training in particular, I think it's hard because oftentimes, I don't know if you observe this, but in clients that we work with, the foundation is often so shaky. We need to start there first. So, overall, let's make sure, we're eating consistent meals, blood sugar's regulated with, meals that contain adequate carbs, adequate protein. But then there's also the, kind of time period specifically post-workout, post-training, where we can kind of optimize that muscle protein synthesis, the building and repair of lean muscle. And that's where we can kind of bring in carbs and protein in a more targeted way to kind of support that process and optimize recovery and kind of what we're usually looking to achieve with workouts.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the foundational stuff. I think of some of the questions that I just automatically ask clients in their onboarding. It's like, do you train fasted? Do you train? Let me know. Beyond right now, let's nip that in the bud.
Yeah.
Not that people can't. I'm just saying that's just one example. So then a couple other things you mentioned. One was cortisol, which again gets there's a lot of mystery around it. I did have someone recently on the show where we talked about kind of similar to you, all the myths around it, how cortisol is really just a lagging indicator of what's going on with your stress system. And there's all these things upstream that can affect not only the production of cortisol, but the timing and the cycling of your
Mhm.
cortisol. And you're right. When people, I mean, anecdotally, like you probably have worked with hundreds, thousands of clients, you see adding in those carbs, like nothing, generally nothing but wonderful results within
Nothing but
days or
wonderful
weeks.
results. Yep.
It's like, oh my gosh, what was I missing all these years? Oh my gosh, I feel better. Oh my gosh, I
Yep.
can do this and that. Or I'm starting to lose fat or whatever. It's crazy. And the only time I'd ever recommend low carbs is when you are in a calorie deficit and it tends to follow the calories, right? Like I am in a fat loss phase now, so my
Yeah.
carbs are only 150 and not 400. You know what I mean? But they're
Yeah.
not like 30,
Right.
30.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
and I think carefully selected the word phase, right?
Yes,
Where it's like an intentional phase where we're
exactly.
making adjustments with, caloric intake, with carbohydrate intake. And I think what we see is, women that have been trying to, cut carbs and eat low calorie for a decade, right?
Of course.
So, yeah, I think that's a keyword that you use in terms of phase and the intentionality behind that.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, listeners, anybody who's listening to the show for a while know how much I love cutting, bulking, phases, stair
Yeah.
step, like really making it work for you. And then the other thing you mentioned at some point you mentioned it was blood sugar and insulin. You kind of alluded to it. One of the fears is blood sugar spikes. I talked to someone who had a CGM, continuous glucose monitor for listeners, and she said she stopped eating potatoes because her blood sugar was spiking. I'm like, we got to get some education here, right? Because
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
blood sugar spikes are normal. They're going to happen. They're especially
Yep.
going to happen when you're only eating carbs. But there's lots of things to mitigate them with. You mentioned balanced meals. I think you mentioned balanced meals.
Yeah.
And also lifting weights mitigates it, walking mitigates it. But let's just touch on that real quick again, because people are afraid about insulin sensitivity, pre-diabetes, metabolic disease, getting fat from carbs, like that
Mhm.
blood sugar piece of it.
Yeah, and understandably so with all the, kind of misinformation out there, but ultimately we need carbs to support and regulate our blood sugar, but we always have to think about the context. So, to your point, carbs are supposed to be easily digested. They are supposed to make our blood sugar rise. Would, we recommend eating a potato alone as your meal? No, right? Because that's going to produce a, bigger, more rapid spike
Mhm.
in blood sugar and insulin. That's where we want to think about, kind of food pairings and combinations. So we always want to ideally make sure that we're, especially at meals, incorporating, carbohydrates alongside adequate protein, alongside, fiber, alongside healthy fats, all of which are going to help to slow down the digestion of glucose and to kind of elongate the blood sugar curve after we eat to prevent, big spikes and crashes, or kind of riding that blood sugar roller coaster.
Mhm.
So, but again, it's important for, I think, people to know that if our body isn't getting energy, carbohydrates from food, it's going to find it elsewhere. And that's where, again, we if we're experiencing, say, blood sugar crashes or lows because we're prolonging our overnight fast way too long, we're skipping meals, we're eating low carb, what happens is the body's going to sense that low energy availability, and it's going to start pumping out cortisol, which is, by definition, a glucocorticoid, meaning, again, one of its primary jobs is to help regulate blood sugar. So cortisol is going to tap into, carbohydrate stores in, our liver and our muscles, and kind of dump that into the bloodstream to normalize things. At the same time, it's also going to tell our cells to become more resistant
Mhm.
to insulin. So, it will kind of impede or impair our ability to kind of utilize, carbohydrates efficiently. So it kind of backfires at the end of the day
Right.
when we're just sort of like arbitrarily, kind of cutting carbs, going low carb. So ultimately, we want to experience a rise in blood sugar after
Mhm.
eating. We just want that to be more stable. We want slow rolling hills throughout the
Absolutely.
day versus like the big peaks and valleys. And that's where I think there's just so much misinformation and lack of education out there. And I think what, we really strive to do with the women we work with is to get them feeling confident with how to actually like utilize carbohydrates to
Mhm.
enhance how your body is functioning and to enhance how you're feeling and to support that, healthy blood sugar regulation.
Yeah, it's like, these hormones are agnostic, right? Like hormones aren't out to get you. And something like insulin is extremely beneficial tool for us, especially when we're active and lifting. It's the resistance, and it's the counteracting that, with the lifestyle choices like cutting carbs that tend to make the difference. So okay, all right. I know we got off a very valuable tangent, but getting back to the cycle syncing. You mentioned a few things in the research about, in general, everything's a normal curve, right, for the population. In the menstruation cycle and follicular, that could be potentially the higher recovery, higher performance part of the half of the month. Does that mean the other half, in relative terms, might feel like a drain to a lot of women, or is it more of a baseline?
Yeah, great question. So I would say entering the luteal phase, that kind of like final or fourth phase of the menstrual cycle, some more significant changes occur that can and should impact how women feel. I don't want to make it seem like robots and nothing is happening internally
Mhm.
and we should feel like, exactly the same every day throughout our cycle. Experiencing subtle shifts is normal. And when I say subtle shifts, I'm talking, some subtle shifts with energy, maybe some subtle shifts with mood or stress resilience, but these things should be subtle and not wildly disruptive. We shouldn't be experiencing extreme anxiety in our luteal phase, digestive symptoms, exhaustion, crazy mood swings. These are all indications that likely the body needs deeper support, and there are some bigger, more significant imbalances at play that might need to be addressed. But I would say, again, in a general sense, going into the luteal phase, that second half of the cycle, so that's where progesterone and estrogen are going to be higher. This combination, or I kind of refer to it as like the 1-2 punch of having both of these hormones being higher, does decrease our stress resilience. So our body is less resilient to stress. Our immune system is actually altered, and the body is in a more pro-inflammatory state throughout the luteal phase. And it essentially, the increase in progesterone in particular, it increases our sympathetic drive. So the body having more of an affinity for kind of that fight or flight mode. Progesterone also increases the breakdown of muscle. So it's essentially catabolic, and
Catabolic,
that's
yep.
to prioritize, right, the uterus over, skeletal muscle. During the luteal phase, our core body temperature increases, or, there's more issues with like thermoregulation, or ability to kind of, maintain body temperature. Blood sugar is also impacted, where we are a little bit less sensitive to insulin, on a cellular level. Our, breathing rates are impacted. So there are more significant changes. A couple other things to note would be, sodium absorption is decreased. Our energy expenditure at rest actually also increases a little bit, from anywhere from like 2 to 10%. So not crazy, but we, actually may need more energy, more calories during this phase of our cycle. So I would say in general, the luteal phase is a time where the body overall is just a bit less resilient. Does that mean you can't do any, type of movement? No, absolutely not. But in general, I tend to consider the luteal phase as a period of time where women can benefit from more steady state cardio, from low impact strength training, mobility work, and focusing on recovery if we were pushing it a little bit harder, say in the follicular phase. So I think it's just important to acknowledge those, physiological shifts. And we'll work with many women as an example that are, going to Orange Theory and trying to, hit PRs 3 to 5 days a week. And they're doing that every single week throughout their cycle, despite maybe not feeling so great in the
Mhm.
luteal phase. And, they might notice going, engaging in those higher intensity workouts during the luteal phase, their sleep is disrupted, their energy is crashing, their digestion is off. So, which would all be signs that, hey, maybe the context right now isn't the time for the ultra high intensity workouts, and maybe we need to peel back a little bit. So, definitely some shifts happening in the luteal phase that I would say are more significant. One thing to note too is that the body actually, there's increased fat utilization in the luteal phase based on what's happening hormonally. To kind of bring all of this together from like a recommendation, action based standpoint, the luteal phase, generally, we may need to eat a little bit more. So, always eat to hunger, make sure we're responding to hunger and not kind of, trying to white knuckle it and then overeating at the end of the day. If our body is hungry, let's respond to that. We may benefit from increasing protein and fat intake a little bit. So again, fat utilization is a little bit higher because, progesterone is catabolic. We may want to incorporate more protein, to support that, to support, lean muscle. And from a carbohydrate perspective, we absolutely are still going to want to, incorporate carbohydrates consistently, but we may put a little bit of less of an emphasis on carbohydrates during this time frame than we did say in the follicular phase where we want to make sure we have that readily available glucose to fuel our workouts. So we still want to support consistent carb intake, but we may be focusing more so on protein and on fats, which I think naturally too a lot of women kind of gravitate towards in terms of like we're a little bit hungrier, cravings are a little bit higher, and protein and fats are really these deeply satiating foods and really help with that blood sugar regulation. This might also be a period of time where we kind of, if we're taking more of a micro focus on things, we may really amp up our anti-inflammatory intake. So we're in more of that, kind of pro-inflammatory state. Again, recovery isn't as great. So that might be a way that we can really support our body with increasing, anti-inflammatories. And that might mean, incorporating more of our, bright, colorful fruits and veggies, our, herbs and spices, our, beets, our cruciferous veggies, our fatty fish, and things that are, kind of flooding the body with more kind of compounds that are helping to kind of counteract or combat that pro-inflammatory state.
Yeah, this is great. There's a lot to unpack, as they say in there. One thing that stands out to me is tying back to listening to your body earlier, the idea of your hunger signals. Once you get the foundations, which I know you've said multiple times, it's like having the foundation of good balance, lots of fruits and vegetables, micronutrients, just a good baseline. I suspect your hunger signals are better in line. And if you're not constantly dieting, constantly cutting carbs, constantly doing like massive chronic cardio, then that puts you in a position where if your body has a little more hunger in one phase versus another, you can follow it. And I can attest to that anecdotally. I've definitely worked with women who, I always like to start people with very, very simple protocols because we don't know yet. And then you find they tend to eat more calories at this point, and then they're perfectly fine over here. Like, oh, okay, there's a pattern. And you're a woman, so I suspect what it might be. Let's make sure we're tracking that along with your period. I'm a big tracking and data nerd. So, which leads to my next question, Jillian, which is, are there measures that would help enhance your understanding of this, like HRV, because you mentioned the resilience level and the parasympathetic gap shortens and things like that?
Yeah, love that. So absolutely, for people that have, an Oura ring or a Whoop or something that can give you a little bit of, feedback about what's going on in your body, you will likely notice, even if, you're not super symptomatic, things are really balanced, dialed in with your nutrition lifestyle, you will notice that your HRV is likely lower in the luteal phase. You'll notice that your, body temperature is elevated. If your tracking device is kind of looking at, I know like the Oura ring specifically can kind of track pockets of, rest and recovery versus, pockets that you're in a more stressed out state, you may notice there being some significant shifts going from the follicular phase to the luteal phase and maybe not having changed anything or having any external factors that are driving that. And that's kind of based on these internal physiological shifts that we're describing. And that's normal. And so again, I think it's listening to how your body's communicating with you. And I think, giving yourself permission in those situations to rest a little bit more, to really focus on, nourishment and, not trying to do the same thing every day, all month long, because, the benefits of any type of exercise, but particularly if we're talking about challenging ourselves, the HIIT workouts and things like that, context is king at the end of the day. So, stress from exercise is healthy and adaptive and can improve our resilience in the right context. In the wrong context, that's where, may end up creating more symptoms for ourselves or, kind of creating barriers with the goals that we're working towards.
So context is everything. Don't force it. Listen to your body. And people get frustrated with those responses, the it depends response, but it really does come down to that. No, I don't.
The most value that I got from this was the fact that I had someone that I could talk to about anything and that there was going to be no judgment. It was just, well, here are your goals. Here's the best way that you're going to achieve it. And then let's work together to help you feel inspired and motivated to do that. And there's a lot of people out there trying to be coaches, and not all of them have done the work. And also just be a genuine person that is positive and coming from the heart in terms of wanting to help. And Philip really embodied all of those qualities. I would recommend him to just about anyone that's looking to achieve goals in that realm of their nutrition and building new habits.
So, but speaking of that, I know there are other extremes of this where, and this is where maybe the diet culture and the marketing side of this goes haywire, is when I hear listen to your body, that can have such a spectrum of interpretation. One being an excuse not to train hard, for example. And by training hard, like, again, my audience is a lot of, we talk about strength training, lifting. We don't really classify it as like heavy versus intense or anything. It's just progressive overload, getting stronger, building muscle, whatever makes sense for you. But what I would be remiss is if somebody hears the message and says, okay, well, I'm just a little bit down in this part of my cycle, so I'm going to completely change my programming and I'm not going to lift heavy weights or whatever it is that my program states. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a balance there. And, I think this can also kind of loop back to, assessing the context in terms of, what's going on in terms of why might I be feeling this way? How did I sleep last night? What are my stress levels? Like how's my, how are my nervous system outlets? Am I, fueling really well? Whenever your body's kind of giving you some signals of any sort, whether it be, low energy, disrupted sleep, digestion is off, mood is off, aim to pause, take a step back and kind of assess what's going on here and what does my body actually need. If we identify that, I'm in my luteal phase, but like I've been fueling well, my stress is low, I'm sleeping really good, maybe I actually do just need to get out there and move my body. And that's what's going to help, kind of shift things and help me to feel better. And I'll pay attention to how I feel during that workout and in the hours after. I think that being an important piece of things that can often give us some helpful information. I don't know if you agree with this, totally open to your thoughts, but I do find, particularly with talking about, say, like luteal phase shifts, paying attention to, energy in particular, like, during, immediately after, and in the hours after can be helpful. If we're feeling good while we're working out, we're feeling good afterwards, and our, energy is good and consistent beyond that, great. That's, awesome. That's probably a sign that, things are well balanced. If we're doing that workout and, 2-3 hours later, we're crashing and we feel like we need to take a nap and we can't focus and, there's symptoms popping up there, that's where I'd say we need to make adjustments. What I don't want cycle syncing to come across as is that, like, women are, weak and can't work out for, half of the month. That is the opposite what I'm saying. Women are strong AF, and it's so important to not kind of let this external information tell you that, like, oh, I can't do something at a certain time. First and foremost, listen to your body. If you're feeling good, give it a try, focus on all those foundations. But I think if it's hard with the, again, like say the motivation piece or the making excuses, because as always, there's like so much.
Yeah, no.
nuance there.
Yeah, I feel you. And for sure, you're not coming across at all as portraying women that way at all. And I always, could get into hot water when I talk about women in general, just, especially in modern society. But I know women that I've coached tend to be like super, what's the word? Like extremely committed and dedicated and seem to recover almost and take more volume than some men in terms of like attacking the hard thing that they need to do. And again, these are just generalizations because there's plenty of men but I like that you said that. Basically, there is a fine balance. And you asked if I agree with what you're saying. I totally agree. I think there's fatigue and recovery issues that we have to be almost more cognizant of than necessarily the stimulus side of our workout. We almost need to just pick a baseline to try for our training, whether that's a volume or intensity based approach. You don't know how you're going to respond until you've trained, right? Like beginners just don't know. So it's always best to start really simple and don't put a lot of movements in there. Don't put a ton of, volume and try to constantly be getting your heart rate up. Just keep it simple, right? Keep a lot of recovery and a lot of space in there. And then you can say, okay, my back's feeling good. I'm sleeping fine. I'm able to go in and progress a little bit. The excuse part in my head comes from the small subset of folks who will say, like, it's just hard. And now because I have this other thing going on, I'm not going to do it. And again, it's not a women thing. It's a men thing too. Trust me. So I don't know where I'm going on with all that, Jillian, but I think people think about these things. So do I.
Totally.
All right. So we touched on cycle syncing from the research a bit. Is there anything else, I guess, in the research that you think is particularly notable or that we've discovered, especially lately, as this topic's been learned more about? I know women's health has been like a black box for so long, and we're starting to finally do research around this.
Yeah.
Is there anything else people should know about it?
Yeah, I think we kind of covered the big rocks with cycle syncing or, kind of what's happening with these shifts throughout our menstrual cycle and kind of some foundational shifts that we can make. I think one thing I'd mention, which I think you've covered on the podcast, is just for women in particular of reproductive age and maybe kind of reconsidering the prolonged fasting or the fasted workouts really at any time in their cycle. That's kind of one additional side note that I would mention.
Cool. No, it's a good, you mean not doing it at all?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree. I agree. I always put this tiny caveat of like, well, a small subset of people may find that they thrive on it, but that's more of my like CYA because somebody out there is going to say that it works great for them. They don't have any issues, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, don't do it. It's kind of like the advice where you build muscle on low carbs. There's some people that do it, but why do it? You just have the carbs flooding in your system and it'll make it a lot easier.
Yeah.
What about, okay, so birth control, irregular cycles, I don't know, those are two separate things, but especially birth control is a super hot topic. And I know your thoughts on it because I've seen your social media and I know a lot of women's thoughts on it as well as my own. I don't like it. I don't like birth control because of a lot of things, especially the pressure on young women to do it. Like get it over the counter. It's like, it's treated like candy almost compared to bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, which is somehow evil. And yet that's super helpful for a lot of women. So take it away. Take it away.
I love this topic so much. And definitely something I'm very passionate about and was honestly like a part of my own health journey a decade ago. But ultimately, I always like to preface conversations like this by mentioning I am never anti-medication. Medication can be a helpful tool and I always support clients' autonomy to make decisions that feel really great for them there. The two big issues I have with birth control in particular are one, the lack of informed consent in terms of women really not being given all the information they need to actually make educated, empowered decisions around birth control. And the other big issue that I have is ultimately birth control being used to treat every women's health symptom and ailment under the sun. If you have an irregular...
From a very young age.
Very young age. It's horrifying. If you have an absent...
I have two daughters, just so you know, because that's why it kind of pisses me off.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And so great that you have this, knowledge though, because I think, so often we trust our doctors and, if they're recommending birth control that, we're going to, especially for parents, they're trying to do the best they can for, their young daughters. But ultimately, birth control is really overused and abused. And I think in my practice, I'm seeing a lot of the implications of that ultimately, where I think it's something like over 50% of birth control, is used for non-pregnancy prevention reasons. I wouldn't even be surprised if the statistic is higher than that.
I can believe that. Yeah.
Right. So it's like, if you don't have a period, if your period's irregular, if your period's heavy, if it's painful, if you have acne, if you have, mood swings, if you have endometriosis. If you have PCOS.
Exactly.
The first line of intervention is birth control. And the reason that's so frustrating is because, hormonal birth control, particularly, the oral contraceptive, the combined oral contraceptive, which is most commonly used, it's essentially, disrupting communication between the brain and the ovaries. It is shutting down the reproductive system or kind of shutting your own hormones off. So although this may provide, say, some symptom relief, it's a big fat Band-Aid, at the end of the day. And what's most bothersome is that people aren't asking the question, why? Why don't we have a regular period? There's a reason that, our period and consistent ovulation is considered a fifth vital sign. So why aren't we getting a period? Why are our periods extremely painful or heavy or symptomatic? These things don't happen for no reason. And that's a lot of the work that we do with clients in terms of let's dig a little bit deeper here and ask the question why and actually understand, why these symptoms are happening, what imbalances are driving them, and how can we really support the body back to balance. And it's, really devastating for women who, for example, will work with clients that have, were put on birth control because they didn't have a period or it was really, irregular when they were in middle school or high school. And 15 years later, they're come off and they're ready to start their family and their period's still not there. Right. And it's, or if they're put on birth control for managing or suppressing symptoms, they come off and those symptoms come back with vengeance and they feel, like, oh my gosh, I'm at square one. What do I do here? And then when they seek out support from their healthcare provider, often it's like birth control or bust. So that's the issue I have is that, women aren't given all the information to make those informed decisions, to understand, how is this birth control actually working in my body? What are the pros and cons, the potential side effects that I should be aware of? And also, just the lack of investigative work in terms of actually understanding why women are experiencing symptoms. And women deserve better. They deserve better. And we can get to the bottom of these things and often eliminate these symptoms naturally, get the period back, get us ovulating regularly naturally. But women aren't even given that opportunity, which is wildly frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The discussion around birth control almost never has to do with it being a prophylactic,
Right,
at this point, which tells you something. And then, again, you called it the fifth vital sign, which is amazing because we know like amenorrhea can be caused by lots of these lifestyle changes we already addressed, like the lower carbs, the lower calories, low energy availability is one, right? You see that in physique competitors particularly, and then some other sorts of issue that might be happening that you want to resolve first. So I'm glad that you work with women on those kinds of things, and it sounds like you come to it from generally a natural position at first, but aren't precluding medications when needed, which is a great, balanced approach to have, in my opinion. On a lighter note, but potentially it could get controversial, are you open to a few rapid fire questions here?
Oh, yeah.
Just like short answers are fine.
Yeah.
I came up with 4 that I thought might be interesting. So the first one is, what's the biggest false claim about cycle syncing? I'll leave that in because that's funny.
Yeah, that I would say that cycle syncing is the solution to PCOS, endometriosis, and these actual, and endocrine metabolic conditions. That is it.
Download my free guide to fix PCOS with cycle syncing. All right. Yeah. What's the most overrated hormone supporting supplement?
I would say DIM.
Okay. Tell us more. People don't know what that is.
DIM or diindolylmethane is a really common compound found in hormone balancing supplements. A lot of really popular trendy ones. And it's a compound that can actually influence the overall levels of estrogen and how we're breaking down and metabolizing estrogen. And I see a lot of women kind of taking it willy-nilly. I have hormonal acne. I have, painful periods. And it's something that can be beneficial in the right context, but without lab data and an assessment, I see women sort of taking DIM willy-nilly. And so, yeah.
No, it's good to know. I mean, I'm sure there's a whole list you could have come up with. That's just one. What's the worst advice you've seen just in general about hormones? I know it's kind of a general question.
Oh gosh. So much bad advice. The worst advice in general with hormones, I think a specific one that doesn't come to mind in isolation. I would say just in general, the very zoomed in micro strategy recommendations that I kind of mentioned this early on in relation to cycle syncing, but I think it stems from the influencer of steal my hormone balancing morning routine. I have, my green powder and then my lemon water and this and that. And it's not that those things can't be, beneficial or helpful, but I would say just all these zoomed in recommendations that totally miss the forest for the trees. There's no personalization or customization. I think that's what kind of keeps women on the symptom hamster wheel.
So great. I have another podcast, experimental podcast called Nutrition Science Daily. And almost every episode, I try to have some sort of boogeyman trigger like that. You mentioned lemon water. I think I had an episode about lemons, and it's like you said, could these be helpful, beneficial for something? Yeah. Oh, maybe for electrolytes. Yeah. But it's not going to solve all your problems and burn fat and fix your hormones. So that's the key. All right. Last one. This is going to be an interesting one. What are your thoughts on male coaches working with women?
Yeah. So, I'm all for it if the male coach is respectful of and takes female physiology into consideration. I think in any situation, if you're a female coach or a male coach, it's important to have some level of understanding of female physiology, depending on like where an individual is at in the life cycle and what's happening with hormones, not even just speaking to like the menstrual cycle and the reproductive years. But I think it's important to have some education, with female physiology and to take that into account and to not, kind of treat male and female clients as exactly the same, because there's, a lot of physiological differences there.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm always curious about that because I can say that my women clients have been one of my best teachers about women's
Yeah.
physiology. But at the same time, I do encourage any coach, like you said, men or women, to be educated on a lot of these nuances and also be skeptical of what you're reading and where the source of the information is. Cause like, I'd love bringing you on the podcast here because we can discuss that it is a nuanced thing and that you shouldn't ever go overboard and that it's personal. So
Yes.
with that said, what does the process look like if someone either wants to work with you or just in general figure this stuff out? Because it sounds complicated. If you're listening to the show, you're like, man, she covered a lot of things and we're just scratching the surface. How can we take off that stress a little bit?
Yeah. And it at the end of the day, it doesn't have to be complicated. I know it can
Yep.
sound like that when we're, hitting on all sorts of different topics, but at the end of the day, I think when you have custom support and a clear plan and you're not trying to like pick and choose and throw things at the wall and see what sticks, it all comes together then. But in terms of working with us, you can find out a little bit more about, how me and my dietitians work with clients on my website, which is just jilliangreaves.com. We work with people with women specifically in a 6-month container. So, as healing, achieving goals takes time. So we require that 6-month commitment and, really support clients comprehensively from lab testing, nutrition, lifestyle, supplements, mind body techniques, and really kind of try to lay out a clear blueprint with that deep customization to remove the overwhelm and ideally help women get to where they want to go.
Awesome. And I definitely have an abundance mindset when it comes to when other coaches on my show, I'm like, I want to recommend Jillian here because just through our conversation and our back and forth, I highly respect what you do and where you come from and the approach you take. So if anybody is looking for exactly what Jillian provides, having a coach for any issues you have is going to accelerate things massively. And I don't say that just because I'm a coach. I believe it, and that's why I became a coach. So having said all that, go to jilliangreaves.com. Jillian's been fantastic. I loved our conversation, getting into the weeds on some of these things. Ladies, men, don't cut carbs all the time. Stop training fasted. Support and listen to your body, and you're going to thrive out there. So thank you so much, Jillian, for coming on.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.